Well, firstly, thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. I know that many of my countrymen and women voted to leave the European Union, but I'm pleased that we are still at least involved in lots of discussions with you. Today I'm going to speak about what happens when people actually retire, and a big question that we have, I suppose, surprisingly had to confront in the UK, because it was, to many, quite a shock when the government decided to do this, is essentially the question: what should retirees be able to do with the savings that they have put aside during their working lives? Should they be able to decide exactly how they should spend that money, or should the government have a greater say in deciding what they should do with it? And the title is Options and Freedoms: Should Seniors Be Able to Decide Themselves How to Spend Their Retirement Money? I'm going to start by talking a bit about the background and what we do in the UK in terms of pensions. I've got just one slide on this, so I'll go through it quite quickly, but it's relatively important to the extent that this really frames the choices that individuals have. So we have a state pension that's based on the contributions that individuals make over their working lives. So mostly those contributions come from what we call national insurance, and those are done through going to work and you pay national insurance contributions. You can also earn those contributions by doing other things that are seen to be socially worthwhile. So that might be bringing children up, it might be providing care to other people. And the government's been trying to make that state pension much simpler. So we now have a state pension which is £156 per week. That's about 170-ish euros. It probably would have been a lot more before we decided to leave the European Union. But if you're a low-income pensioner, and you might be a low-income pensioner because you haven't made enough contributions during your life up to retirement, you can also get top-ups to that. So the top-ups include housing benefits. So the government will pay support to people if they have a low income so they can afford to rent a house. The government will also provide a top-up to people so they can afford to pay local taxes. And people also, if they have a very low contribution levels over their working age life, can also get essentially a credit to take it up to a reasonable level. And as I'll come to later, the level that the government has set it at is just above what the government determines as being the poverty line. So one of the intentions is that no pensioner who is on this basic state or the single tier pension will be in poverty. So that's the state pension. The bit I'm going to talk about mainly is the private pension. So this is the bit that layers on top of that. Ol was mentioning earlier about the shift that's happened in his country, in Sweden, away from defined benefit pensions to defined contribution pensions. So in a defined benefit pension, essentially the employer usually is taking all of the risks and is guaranteeing that they'll pay you a certain amount in retirement. And what we've seen is employers getting worried about covering those risks. And in the UK, now in the private sector, I don't think there are any employers now that are taking on new people into defined benefit schemes. They're all running defined contribution. And so today I'm going to be speaking specifically not only about private pensions, but really about defined contribution pensions. And the principle here is that each individual puts some money into a savings during their working life, and then when they reach retirement age, that money, which is built up, they can make choices on how that money is invested, is the money that will have to fund their retirement on top of the state pension. And as I mentioned, there's been a big shift away from defined benefit, and defined contribution really is the way that pensions will continue in the UK. And to add to that, we also had a reform in 2012, which was called Auto-Enrolment. A large proportion of the UK population actually don't save. It was estimated at about 11 million people out of our working population of, I think, about 26 million. So a large proportion haven't been saving, and the government has been wanting them to save. It's now compulsory for employers to offer a pension, and individuals are automatically put onto that scheme. They can opt out, but as it is, only a small proportion are opting out. So now I'm going to talk more directly about this issue about what happens when people reach retirement. The old policy, which I think is similar to what happens in Estonia, was that essentially people had to buy an annuity, i.e. they had to buy a guaranteed income from an insurer. So in doing that, they would be insuring against longevity risk, and I suppose also the insurer would be taking any risks associated with investment. It wasn't absolutely mandatory, but if you didn't buy an annuity, you were faced with a 55% tax on any money that you withdrew from your pension. So in effect, there's such a level of tax penalty that it was a compulsory scheme. But in April 2014, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, who quite liked tinkering with the country's pensions, introduced a new policy whereby people could take out their pensions in any way they wanted from the age of 55. And in doing so, they would only be subject to the normal rates of income tax. So essentially that took away any disincentive that there was from not buying an annuity. I've just got the tax rates there, but that isn't really the point. The point is really that there used to be a very significant disincentive from taking all your money out and you had to buy an annuity. Now that's gone. You can do what you want with it. And just briefly, I mean, the background the government spoke about, and I suppose it would be interesting to think about the sort of the context for different countries. They spoke about deteriorating annuity rates. I mean, that's partly just, we saw some very interesting slides from Sweden about longevity. That's partly just the fact that people live longer, so your pension has to last a lot longer. But also there are the yields on gilt rates has been much lower. The government also, and I think this is a valid consideration here, they wanted to make pension saving more attractive. So the premise being, if individuals had greater discretion over what they could do with their money, then maybe they would be ready to save more during their working lives. Now, as I mentioned later, we don't know whether that has an effect. I mean, it potentially is a positive effect if it does exist. They're also worried about competition in the annuity market. So mainly what was happening was individuals were saving with a certain insurer when they joined their working lives, and then they were simply buying an annuity from that same insurer without seeing whether they could have got a better deal. And a lot of people were ending up on quite poor products, essentially. They could have got a much better deal if they'd gone to the market. Allied to that is, I think there's just a greater diversity in retirement. So not only are people living longer, but people are having very varied experiences in retirement. So requiring them all to have exactly the same sort of product, again, has some potential theoretical basis. And just in terms of to tell you a bit about the magnitude of the reform. So we've got about 2 million, in the UK we've got about 2 million people aged 55 to 70 with about 175 billion of defined contribution savings. So that's the kind of money that we're talking about at the moment and the sorts of numbers of people. So I'm going to talk about, for the rest of the presentation, after I've just gone through this, a bit about the UK, but then try and learn some lessons about what's happened in other countries where they've had these sorts of reforms for a bit longer. This is essentially the scheme now. So this is the amount of money you've saved up. You're allowed to take a quarter of it without paying any tax at all. So there's a strong incentive for people to get that money out. And then you essentially have, I've tried to simplify this because I know the pension industry love very complex things, but this is as simple as I can get it. You've essentially got three options. You can buy an annuity, you can go into an income drawdown product. So essentially that's a product where you essentially drip feed money out to you, and you determine how quickly the money comes out, or you can take all of the money out. It is obviously a lot more complex than that, but I'm trying to keep it simple. I've discussed what I'm going to be covering, so I'm going to tell you a bit about what the early evidence from the UK is about what people are actually doing with this money. And I will mention that this information is only semi-helpful. So this information comes from the Financial Conduct Authority, which is the main regulator in the UK of financial services. And this pie chart covers pension pots of people with defined contribution pensions in the 6-month period and looks at what the people did with that money. So you can see that this proportion here purchased an annuity. So that's a small proportion of the whole. This proportion in green took one of those drawdown policies. So essentially they put their money into an account and they were able to take out some of the money, but they didn't take all of the money out. And this proportion, half, took all of the money out. Now that, on its own, this looks very concerning. The issue is we don't know who these people are. So it could be that these people, and many of them will, I mentioned earlier that a lot of the previous generation were on defined benefit pensions. They may also have other pensions which provide them with an annual income, and therefore it may be totally logical to take out all of their money in their defined contribution pensions. So we can't really learn that much so far from the UK, but what we can do is try and learn from some other countries. So what we did in a piece of research is look at 2 other countries where they have very similar freedoms at the point of retirement. We're worried about a number of things, but were retirees able to withdraw the money as they liked? Were they penalised for withdrawing savings? And what we can see is that in Australia and the United States, they actually have a pretty similar regime to the one that UK has, i.e. you get to retirement age and you can do the heck you want with your money. And they've both been running these regimes for some time. So it allows us to look at what people have actually done with their pensions in those countries. So the first point is that I mentioned earlier about the UK and the proportion that are currently buying an annuity. This is the proportion that used to buy an annuity. 75% used to buy an annuity. There were some exceptions, as I think there are in Estonia, for people so people with a very high guaranteed income already didn't have to do it, and people with a very low pension didn't have to do it, but 75% bought an annuity. In America, 10% buy an annuity, and in Australia, 5%. So depending how kind of risk averse you are and worried about what people are going to do with their money, that's a relatively concerning figure to start with. Through the research, we then looked at what the Americans and the Australians did with their pensions. So how quickly did they spend their pensions during retirement? I suppose the first point is that there's huge variation, as one might expect. But we tried to draw out a few patterns. So I will start with these 2 here. Sorry, I've gone the wrong way. This one here is what we've termed the cautious Australian. Now, actually, interestingly, that's the average behaviour. The mean behaviour is to spend, I think it's just under 1% of your pension pot each year. That's very, very cautious. I'll come to some of the implications in a moment. Then I've got here the typical American. So this is the average American behaviour, is quite a lot more aggressive, is to spend around 8% of their pension pot per year. And then what I've got here is a subset of the Australian population called the quick spending population. And this reflects the fact that a significant minority, I think it's about 35% of Australians, spend their pensions within, by the age of 70, which we calculated ended up as essentially a spending pattern of about 12% per year. So the purpose of doing this was so that we could then look at what would be the implications if people in the UK were to follow these spending paths, which I will now talk about in a bit more depth. Before I do that, I'm just going to mention a bit about what some of these people spend their money on when they do take it out. There's some quite interesting research in Australia, because obviously it matters a lot. If someone takes all of their money out of their pension and then they do something in inverted commas sensible with it, i.e. make another investment, then that may be no bad thing. It shows that quite a few people put money into their house, so in a way that is a form of investment, although it may not be terribly liquid. It shows that quite a lot of people spend money on holidays and on cars. Now that might be a bit more concerning. Interestingly, when the reforms were introduced, the pensions minister in the UK said that he was quite happy for people to spend their money on Lamborghinis. That got quite a lot of coverage. So I'm now going to talk about some modelling we did where we looked at the implications of following various paths. And I should say at this point, for the people who took their money out of their pension and didn't buy an annuity, what we've done is we've put them through a model that assumes that the uncertainty that exists in the markets over a period of time, your investments may do very well and then go very bad, or might do the opposite, are reflected in the model. So the first point is we're looking here at the typical American. They're spending about 8%. What you can see is this is the years of retirement that the pension will last, and this is kind of the distribution of the population. And we can see that on average, if you took 8% out of your pension per year, you're going to run out of your pension by year 17. So that's before life expectancy for a man, and that's before life expectancy for a woman. But you can also see this huge distribution here. So for 10% of the population, this top 10%, the pension will last until they're 21. And for the bottom 10%, their pension will run out by 12 years into retirement. Now, the difference there is explained by how the investments go in retirement. So in this instance, this 10% will have had an unlucky go at it, and this 10% will have had a really lucky go at it. But there's two main points. The one is that your pensions run out after 17 years, well before life expectancy. And the second one is a huge range in experiences. So there's two forms of risk. There's a straightforward longevity risk that you'll run out of money before you die, but there's also the fact that your investments may do poorly. Here we look at the same issue, but just looking at the different patterns. And this is looking at the chances of you running out of the average when you run out of money. The annuity, you never run out of money, clearly, because you get an income each year. For the cautious Australian I mentioned, who's drawing out at just under 1% a year, essentially it's the same with them. Their money on average will last nearly 60 years after retirement. So there might be one or two lucky people that run out of money. But the risk is not that you're going to run out of money. The risk is that you're not going to be spending enough of your money. I've mentioned the typical American. And then if you look at what we call the quick spending Australian, who's spending about 12% a year, on average, they run out 12 years into retirement. But again, there's a distribution. So some of them will be running out 5 years, and some of them, if they're lucky with their investments, will run out about 15 years later. So I think the main issue here is the longevity point. People aren't insuring against longevity, but there's also this investment point, that your investments could go well or they could go badly, and that will have a really big effect on your outcomes. And then obviously this has an effect on your private incomes. This is looking at the average pension pot and what that would buy you. This is just your private pension. And what we've got here is the annuitant. Somebody buys an annuity. It's not inflation linked, so their money is becoming less valuable in real terms over time. But still they have some income right through to the end of, they would have some income onto here as well. You can also see here the fact that people who spend their money more rapidly in terms of the quick spending Australian or typical American have high incomes to start with, and then it drops off very quickly. And this one here is interesting, the cautious Australian. So the upside of spending your money solely clearly is you have, as we see, money certainly until you're 100, maybe 120. The downside is your income is very low. Your private income is very low. And so in a way, the problem is as much for these people that they may be underspending their pension as anything else. I'll skip that because it's very complex. So I think I was talking there about private incomes. A second consideration is about what the implications might be as a consequence of that for government expenditure. I mentioned earlier there are a number of means-tested benefits that people can receive from the government in retirement. So if individuals spend their money very quickly, it may be that the government ends up with a bigger bill for means-tested benefits because people haven't bought an annuity. And we can see that if we look here, if people get to age 94, if you bought an annuity, this is the amount the government would on average spend on your means-tested benefits. This is for quite a sizable pension pot to start with. And you can see these charts, for all of the other charts, the state would end up having to pay more money on you. In these cases, it's because the individual runs out of money and needs means-tested benefit top-ups. In this case, for the cautious Australian, it's because they're not spending enough each year. So essentially the government's topping them up every year and to get them up to what is deemed to be a socially reasonable level of expenditure. So I'm going to just draw a few conclusions and then pose a few questions. So the risks as we see them are For individuals, you can pot exhaustion, you can run your pension pot down too quickly. You might have low incomes, either because you run it down very quickly and then you don't have any money left, or because you essentially are too risk averse and you try and hold the money back, but only sort of give yourself a very, very modest income during retirement. Overall, this can mean low replacement rates potentially for people later in retirement, and it can bring them closer to poverty. Although importantly, as I say, in the UK, the government has set the state pension at a level so that you shouldn't go into its official measure of poverty, although clearly that's an official measure and people may still feel very poor. And for the government itself, it can lead to higher benefit bills depending on how people spend their money, and overall just a heavier reliance on the state pension. Just a couple of points here about people that are particularly affected, and this is for a number of reasons, but women may be particularly affected, partly because of their lower entitlement to state pensions generally, because they historically they got fewer recognitions for looking after children, and they have a lower labour market participation. Obviously, if you've only got a defined contribution pension, you're at a bigger risk than if you also have some other guaranteed income. Issues, and these were referred to a bit earlier, about when you leave the labour market. So if you leave work earlier, obviously your pension is going to have to last a longer time, and the risk is greater for you here. And also something, an issue about having other assets. Obviously, if you have other assets, those will provide you with a bit of a buffer. I'll skip the topic because actually you're having an interesting presentation later on, I think, about behavioural economics. But I'll just come to what the government's already put in place, and then I have one final slide. So what the government's already done is it acknowledges that there are risks associated with this. So we don't know how people are going to spend their money. In fact, I was just thinking this pension's about the year 2050. I mean, if you look at the people who will be retiring at 65, many of those will still be alive in 2050. And the aim of government policy should really be to ensure that those people have a reasonable income through to the age of 2050. So they've done a number of things. I've mentioned a couple here. Firstly, they've introduced what they call PensionWise, which is a support service for people, so that you can either ring them up or you can have a face-to-face discussion and you can discuss through your options. So it's a form of free guidance, isn't it? It's paid for by the government. And secondly, pension firms are required to essentially advise you as to whether there are risks attached with taking various decisions with your pensions. There are other steps being taken, but I've just mentioned a couple of the significant ones. And this is my final slide. I'll mention a couple of things that we've proposed in our research. So when we did our research, the reform was already in place, and we weren't seeking to question whether it should exist, because we didn't think that would be terribly helpful given it was there. But I suppose the first question would be, is it a good idea? And it'll be interesting to hear people's views on that. But generally, we had more sort of interventions that might help the reform work well. So we thought it would be important to have what we called an early warning system to understand how people are spending their pensions, so that you can then adjust policy. It's important to intervene with people, because often people make very few preparations for retirement. So when they suddenly have this decision to make, they may be very ill prepared for that. I think importantly, one of the reasons the government introduced the reforms was so that what they were worried about is people were getting poor rates on their annuities. They thought maybe people shouldn't have to buy annuities anyway, but also they were getting poor rates. So it's important to think about how we can make sure that people shop around and buy the best product when they do make that decision. But then some slightly bigger questions at the end here. The first one is, the whole policy kind of rests on the sort of the choice theory that individuals are going to be motivated to go out and make a decision. But we kind of know that a lot of people are just going to take the path of least resistance. They're going to, they're going to sit there, and they're probably a lot of them are not actually going to do anything. So what happens to those people? What happens to their money? How is it invested? Are they sort of put into an annuity, or they're not at the moment? What sort of investment should they be put into? How can we get around this issue, which I'm concerned about, is the fact that typically people will not insure against longevity. can we have a system where people maybe pre-commit some of their pension savings into a sort of an annuity pot and then they have another pot where they have total freedom? I think it's in Denmark, I think, where they've got something similar to that. And then the final question, which I'm not in a fit state to answer, although I have a few suggestions, I was based, you might have guessed, should other countries like Estonia follow the UK's example? Thank you very much.
Nigel. Töötab. Nii. Ma annan ühe kommentaari, et selle ettekande peale ma arvan, et väga paljud mõtlevad, et seda teist sammast küll nüüd ei tohiks vist lahti lasta. Ehk siis igaüks võiks kasutada oma teise samba kogutud raha nii, nagu nad tahavad. Kolmanda samba osas meil täna see otsustusõigus on vabatahtliku pensioni osas. Meil kindlasti ei ole nii palju informatsiooni, kogemust ja uurimusi, et kuidas inimesed Eestis käituvad. Aga kui siin alguses oli ka küsimus, et kas me peaksime rääkima kogu asendusmäärast, kus me siis võtame kõik 3 sammast kokku, ja ma arvasin, et see on väga hea idee, siis praegu, kui ma vaatan ka seda Suurbritannia kogemust, siis mul on tunne, et väga paljud inimesed sellesse kogutud rahasse ei suhtu üldse kui pensionilisasse või osasse pensionist, vaid kui lihtsalt kogutud rahasse, mida saab siis sobival hetkel lõbusalt ära kasutada. Tegelikult oligi see nagu kommentaar, et ma näen, et Nigel nagu noogutab ka kaasa, et tihti see nii ongi, et mida siis teha, et nad näeksid seda rohkem nagu pensionina.
Thank you. A very good question. I would view, firstly, I think we should definitely see all the elements of the pension as one. And I think a gentleman mentioned it earlier. Secondly, I think there are real concerns about what people do with the second part of their pension. If we want good replacement rates, and I think in the UK we've looked at trying to get replacement rates at about 65% of earnings during the working life, then we can't be reliant on simply the state pension, and people will have to be drawing down their private pension at a reasonable rate during retirement. Otherwise they're going to have a huge replacement rate followed by a very low replacement rate. I think it's a significant challenge. In terms of whether people are likely to be really frivolous with their money, to be honest, we just don't know at the moment. I've drawn some parallels from what people do in Australia and America. As I say, in Australia, it's interesting the fact that if, for instance, some people are paying off their mortgage, that's a very different sort of act to spending your money on going on holiday. Now, it might have downsides as well, because the money may not be as available as it would be if it was in a pension. But I think we have to think about what people might be doing with that money if they were to take it out of their pension. And I suppose on that point, one of the debates in the UK is that if you have your money in a pension, it should be earning you a decent rate of return, although the risks will be a bit higher. People tend to be very risk averse when they generally have savings, and they'll be putting it into a bank account where they'll be getting 0.25% increase per year, much lower than inflation. So essentially people may be taking actions by taking the money out, which mean their long-term investments are going down.
Aitäh, on Nigelile veel kellelgi küsimusi? Ma saan aru, et te vaatate kõik kella, tõesti on lõunaaeg. Lõunad serveeritakse aatriumis, kus hommikul ka kohvi, koguneme tunni aja pärast siin samas, aga enne Nigelil kingitus ka.